Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I'm actually recording outside, so we'll see how this turns out. What I wanted to talk about today is part of my discussion of the Malazan Book of the Fallen from a reread perspective. And so this is spoilers all for the entirety of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And as I've said in previous things, the thing that I want to talk about is possibly the only spoiler for the entire series that I try to protect people from, because I think it is important because it recontextualizes the series. So today I want to talk about Midnight Tides. Midnight Tides from the perspective of the full series. Complete spoiler warning. Okay, right. So what are some of the things that maybe we can pick up and think about in Midnight Tides, knowing that Kamensod is the narrator? And I think one of the first things is obviously this is the final foundational piece of Kamensod's story. Gardens of the Moon and Memories of Ice work together to establish one aspect. Deadhouse Gates and House of Chains work together to establish the second aspect. Midnight Tides and Reaper's Gale combine to form this third aspect. And it's the combination of these three things that sets up the books Deadhouse Gates and The Crippled God. So we've had the first two foundational aspects laid in place, solidified, cemented. And now we have the third one being introduced. Now that we're familiar with the world, now that we're familiar with the players, now that we're familiar with a lot of these concepts, here is the third arena that is being discussed. And of course, it has massive importance. It shapes who the Bone Hunters are in later books. It is the place from which they launch their entire journey to free the Crippled God. And therefore, this is a foundational aspect of the story. So thinking about it from that perspective, and on a first read, sometimes we go, oh, yet another new place being introduced. But when we have the context of the whole story, we're thinking about it, this is thinking about, if we retrospectively start with where the Crippled God ends up, what are the different things that he needs to introduce? And suddenly we understand this structure. We understand why it has taken this moment, because otherwise we could have had essentially three different book ones or books one before we got any of the follow-ups. And this way there's been kind of a leapfrogging structure, which helps us, allows us to slowly move through and acclimatize to the information. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect I want to discuss is something that is joyful in Midnight Tides, the revelation that Bug is actually Male, the god. And when we think about some of the earlier books, the interactions between the deities, these powerful figures, and mortals, has not always been the most positive or optimistic view of things. This is one of the first times we see a deity figure in a genuine friendship and relationship with a mortal. The relationship between Bug and Tehol is heartening. It is something that is a warm emotional core to the story of Midnight Tides, which, is a tragedy. And one of the fascinating things about this is part of it is an exploration, because remember, it's from Tehol's perspective for the most part. It is an investigation of how Tehol has influenced, shaped, and changed Male. That this is not Male's story, it's Tehol's story. It's a focus on the mortal, about how a mortal became important to a deity, not about how a deity becomes important to a mortal. It's the inverse of that. And there's a very strong thematic exploration of this relationship in Midnight Tides. Another aspect of this that I think is important on a reread is there has been this sort of step forward, step back, this moment or this movement between different aspects of chronology. And again, this is another step back. But in doing this, the crippled god keeps bringing closer and closer focus onto his plans, what he tried to do to illustrate what he actually is being forgiven for or released from. We saw how Perrin, Janos Perrin, accepted the crippled god into the deck, gave him a position. And we've jumped back to before this. With Memories of Ice, we saw the whole aspect of the Panian Domain and what mortals and immortals can do in terms of their destructive nature and how the crippled god was trying to manipulate this to lash out. And this is another look at one of his schemes, one of the things that he tried to do, the corruption of Hanan Mosag, appealing to this base instinct, this desire for power, this ambition that Hanan Mosag had. Now, Mosag may have had some genuine positive reasons for doing this. He wanted to unite the clans. He wanted to make the Eater a powerful force who could not be corrupted or destroyed by another expansionist imperialist empire. There were some good intentions there, but they're also combined with the fact that, yes, this was about his ambition, his desire for power, the assumptions that the crippled god has made about all of these mortals. Because remember, from his perspective, he was brought down onto this world, broken into pieces, tormented. And each of these pieces, when they are discovered, has been corralled, imprisoned, tortured, and used as a sort of cosmic battery to power and aggrandize and empower deities and these other figures. From his perspective, this is what the world is. The world is this abuse of others for your own gain. And so it comes as no surprise that in this particular sequence, in Midnight Tides, we're introduced to a lot of characters who have been enslaved, who serve those more powerful than they are, all for the benefit of these others. Udanas is given a voice. We see the relationship between all of these different figures and god figures. The introduction of Featherwitch and her relationship with the Errant, how the Errant goes about all of these Machiavellian plans. But all of this is tempered by that relationship between Tehol and Bug. This is the crippled god's attempt to understand not only, to use an old expression, man's inhumanity to man, not only to understand the complexity of these dangerous and potentially despicable structures in society and how they abuse their own citizens. There is an attempt to understand that. There's an attempt to understand how you combat this. How do you fight back? Are there different ways of fighting back? And Midnight Tides, because it is overtly a tragedy, is a strong sort of signal that this is a tragic state of affairs. In this, there's almost pity from the crippled god about how this world is functioning. Or we could say how this world dysfunctions. This is explicitly framed as a tragedy. And one of the interesting things about tragedy in this particular sense is it's not necessarily an outright condemnation. There is pity, there is an attempt to understand And there is a desire for a more equitable, more comedic, in the classical sense, outcome. And that thread runs through this. Bad things happen. It ends on a dark note, but there are golden moments in it. And the crippled god tries to focus on that, the despair of Pedak, and yet the compassion that is offered her, not pitying her, not treating her in a patronizing fashion, but an attempt to augment her own agency, to provide the support that she needed in order that she could heal herself. And this is the inherent contradiction about these mortal races that the crippled god is struggling to understand, the sheer variety of these different approaches, the abusers and the abused, the victims and the perpetrators, and how each and every time there are all of these different approaches to rectifying the situation. And it's almost as if the crippled god is testing out, teasing out all of these different ways that people lashing out, people who have been victimized, who have been made into victims, all the different ways that they lash out, all the different ways that they can be healed. And once again, Pedak is at the heart of that. We saw it with Felasin. We have seen it time and time again in this series, where someone has suffered something truly devastating. And the crippled god tests out, how is this resolved? Can we just wave our hand and heal them? Is that the right way forward? Should they be allowed to lash out? Can we understand that? Should we support them so that they can heal themselves? All of these different approaches to understanding trauma and how that trauma has affected someone, and seeing it as a tragedy, not as a condemnation, not as a celebration, but seeing the tragic circumstances and the strength with which these characters do their best within these situations. And of course, one of the aspects, and we see this on a first read, but this particular story is focused very much on the relationship between brothers, just as we saw the relationship between mother and daughter in Memories of Ice, between sisters in Deadhouse Gates, and followed up in House of Chains. This focus on different organizational structures about how we think of ourselves as people, the groups that we are associated with. And the crippled god tries to explore all of these different things in turn, taking a book, a moment, to explore these different ramifications of how humans, how people connect to one another, think about who they are, create identities for themselves. And so from a reread perspective, it's just thinking about a lot of the themes, a lot of the different moments that we pick up on, even on a first read, but taking that step back and thinking about the crippled god, thinking about his status as this victim who has suffered indescribable torment for millennia, and applying that as a lens and a filter to the story to see how aspects of that can maybe shape our understanding, not only of him, but of the situation. Can it make us think about this story in a different way? Because look at the story of Rulad. This obviously is the crippled god's scheme. He was going to torture someone because that's his understanding of the world. Yes, he's going to give them a boon, but he's going to extract a terrible price for it because that's what's been done to him. And so we see, even in this magical sword, this boon, this gift that gives Rulad enormous power, that there is a crippling cost to it. And we follow that collapse of a character who, yeah, even at the beginning, he is arrogant. He is a jumped up teenager despite his age. He is one of those characters who is cocky because he is young. He hadn't experienced the world. But what we see is the corruption of that, the potential threat of what this power can do. And we see the problems that the crippled god is trying to think about. We see how the crippled god wants to manipulate the world on the terms that he understands, and yet is owning up to the cruelty of that, because now he is in the position where he has been free. He is looking back on this and seeing these things that he had done because he felt justified, that as a victim, he had the right to lash out. He had the right to treat people like that. But now looking back on it and telling us this story, he's much more critical of what he did. He doesn't shy away from exposing his faults, that this was the wrong thing to do. And it very much mirrors Felisin and what was done to her, admittedly through Tavor's love and in an attempt to protect her. But here we see the crippled god mirroring that in what he did to Rulad, without any of the mitigation of trying to protect Rulad, trying to care for Rulad. And it's a very stark contrast. But those are just my thoughts on Midnight Tides from this reread perspective, thinking about who Camansod is, what Camansod was going through, and trying to link back the different aspects that we see in the novel to the question, why would Camansod tell us these things, show us these things, and tell us and show us in the way that he has? And I think that gives us a very interesting perspective on the novel. But thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.